Thanks, Nate, and thanks everyone for being here. No place to put this here. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about funding at the National Cancer Institute, and also we'll make some allusions to some issues to think about with regard to NIH more generally. A couple of things to say in advance. A few of us published a paper in PSPR last year that argued that there's a lot we can do in social and personality psychology to improve health outcomes, public health outcomes. And in this paper we talk about some of the barriers to that happening and also the many ways in which this can actually take place. But to do it, you often need funding, right? You need the money to be able to collect populations, to be able to use instrumentation that typically is very costly. And so that's why we have a big grants portfolio, and we invite you to contribute proposals to be able to get some of that money. A couple of overview kind of comments. There are 27 different institutes and centers within the National Institutes of Health. As you may have followed in the news, we got an increase in our budget this year. The budget is $30 billion for NIH. It's a lot of taxpayer money going to research, and that's distributed among the 27 institutes and centers. We also have an Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research that tends to support research that's trans-NIH, goes across multiple different diseases and behaviors, and a number of different initiatives that also cross-cut different diseases. The National Cancer Institute, where I am, is the largest of the 27 institutes, and interestingly enough, the director of our institute, the NCI director, is a presidential appointee. And that's interesting because the only other appointee at NIH, presidential appointee that is the director of NIH. And so NCI in some ways is kind of off to the side, and of those $30 billion that go to NIH, over $5 billion goes to the National Cancer Institute. I'm not telling you that to boast or brag. I'm telling you that because it means that we have a lot of money to do lots of interesting things, and a lot of that money goes to behavioral research. We have the largest behavioral research program not only at NIH, but in the federal government and in any federal government throughout the entire world. We have $160 million approximately in grants and contracts that just goes to behavioral research, in this case, of course, related to cancer. And we also have a large number of full-time equivalents, or FTEs, many of whom are PhD program directors, and many of them are psychologists. Many of them are social or clinical psychologists who you can talk to and get feedback on your ideas. In another paper, the leaders of the program that I represent talked about some of the priorities in behavioral research in cancer. This is a paper in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. And this paper does a better job, I think, than any talk or any other resource at kind of laying out what the problems are in cancer that are behavioral in nature and how you potentially might address them. So I point your attention to that paper as well. When we think about our priorities, we think about behavioral targets and then different levels of influence, you know, the person, the family, the environment, the healthcare system, and so on. And then we also think about methodological advances, new methods, new data analytic tools that can be used to address the data we collect in our research. And I'm just going to give you a listing of behavioral targets we're interested in, not really in any depth. I'm happy to talk to you about any specific ones, particularly if they're related to your work. But this is a nice smattering of things that we do. Tobacco cessation and control is right up at the top. 30% of all cancer deaths are attributable to tobacco use. That's 30%, almost a third. So this is the one we need to hit really hard, and we are hitting very hard, but there's a lot more to do. And the world has gotten a lot more complex lately because while cigarette use has gone down, the use of electronic cigarettes and other tobacco products has gone up. And so we need to try to get our head around what that means. And social and personality psychologists have a lot to say about those issues. Diet, weight, and physical activity, of course, obesity is a risk factor for cancer, sun protection exposure, virus exposure and vaccination. So here we're talking largely about HPV vaccination. This is really interesting. HPV vaccination is probably one of the most important public health tools that we have available to us right now to reduce cancer rates. Cervical cancer can pretty much be obliterated if everybody got HPV vaccinations prior to sexual intercourse. And yet, the rates of HPV vaccination in adolescent boys and girls is still much lower than it needs to be. So think about that. This is a question of persuasion, a question of influence, a question of family dynamics, because often you're talking to your child about getting vaccinated, and you might have to talk about the fact that this is related to sexual behavior. I mean, that's a family dynamic. These are all questions social and personality psychologists care about, and we like to see applications come in that address that. And then alcohol use, which is also a risk factor for cancer. We're interested in sleep hygiene, medication adherence. You probably are aware of the fact that chemotherapy is starting to move into the household and outside of the clinic. People are taking chemotherapy pills at home rather than going into the clinic. And so all the adherence issues that come up, for example, with HIV, are relevant here as well. And so that's something we need more research on. Use of and reactions to genetic and genomic information. Here we are in this world where people can find out everything they want to know about their genes. Wow, right? That's a lot of information. It's personal information. And we need to understand the factors that will moderate people's responses to that information. Attentional errors in diagnostic images and cancer information. So you might be wondering, what the heck is that doing there? Well, that's a cognitive task, right? When a radiologist is looking at a mammography screen, that's a cognitive task. And so we have a cognitive psychologist on staff, and we recruit applications from cognitive psychologists who study vision and attention because it's relevant to understanding errors in radiology, and that's just an example. And then, of course, we're interested in survivorship. The numbers of cancer survivors are going up really quite radically over the last few years, and there's going to come a time when having cancer is pretty much thought of as a chronic disease and not an acute disease, and we're already there with some types of cancer. So that has implications for survivorship, employment, going back to work, going back and making reproductive decisions, family decisions. These are the kinds of things that are important to understand, and they're behavioral in nature. I want to highlight one of our many funding initiatives because this is the one that's probably closest to the work that's done in personality and social psychology, and that is research on affect and decision making. This is a PAR, it's a program announcement with special review, and what that means is that we put together a special review group to review all the applications, and that's a good thing because it means it's people who are in affective and decision science. It's not going to the general study sections that the Center for Scientific Review at NIH puts together, and we have no control over. So this is a really unique initiative and one to think about. And this particular one encourages projects that generate fundamental knowledge of affective processes that are relevant to cancer prevention and control. They should have some downstream consequences for cancer decision making, although it is okay for it to be very downstream, and we have lots of applications that are very basic in nature. And they're expected to engage scientific disciplines that are not traditionally in the cancer research arena. And that includes social psychology. There are a lot of social psychologists doing cancer research, but it's still much smaller than the numbers of public health folks and people from nursing, people from medicine who are doing cancer research. Okay, I wanted to give you a couple of pointers, a couple of little nuggets just to think about in terms of funding. You probably know that your grants are peer-reviewed by a peer review panel. These are folks who have related expertise and are put together by the Center for Scientific Review at NIH. They will work through those grants, and they will give them scores. And if they do extremely well, really, really well, typically a 10th percentile or under, then they almost automatically get funded. And we pay attention to them, and we sometimes pull them if we don't think they should be funded for whatever reason, but that happens very rarely. Where we come in really more is between the 11th and 20th percentile. That's when we can look at all the grants that didn't quite make it, and we call that a pay line, that 10th percentile, although it's not really the way the term is typically used. And between the 11th and 20th percentile, we can say, wow, this one really fills a gap that we haven't filled before. Let's take a look at this one. Or this one is from a new investigator, and we want to increase our numbers of new investigators. So we have some flexibility there. And if you're in that area between 11th and 20th percentile, you want to be in touch with your program director because they can help give you a sense of what the likelihood is of getting funded. And the success rates depreciate greatly past the 14th percentile. I want to highlight, and this is one of those takeaways, if you take 2 or 3 things away from my presentation, this would be one of them, and that is that most of the grants that we fund are what are called investigator initiated. That means you came up with an idea, you had it reviewed, and then if it scores well, it gets funded. Our program announcements, our requests for applications, or RFAs, those are to try to highlight specific areas, but that's a small proportion of our portfolio. We also consider cost as less of an issue than value. So I often have people who are interested in getting grants come up to me and say, should I really do it on the cheap? Should I try to apply for something and say I could do it for $100,000 when I really need $200,000? That's a bad idea because reviewers will figure that out immediately because they're smart and they often have grants themselves. So really, we're looking at value. We're looking at what are we going to get out of this grant. And of course, you want to be reasonable. but think more about the value of the grant than about the cost. And then there are different mechanisms for getting funded. R03s are small grants, typically $50,000 a year for 2 years. That's direct costs. And then your university or your research institution adds indirect costs, which typically is about 25% to that. And we've had a lot of social and personality psychologists get R03s because they're small grants, but they're plenty of money for someone who's getting a salary as an investigator as part of a liberal arts department. If you're in a psychology department and getting 8 or 9 months salary, you don't need as big a grant as someone in a school of public health or school of nursing where they're funding perhaps their entire salary. And so R03s are a good mechanism. R21s are typically pilot grants, and those are about $275,000 a year for 2 years. It's a lot of money, but they're considered pilot money. And R01 grants are the sort of standard grant at NIH. And most of the grants we have that are R01s in our portfolio are between $300,000 to $500,000 a year for 4 or 5 years. That's a mountain of money, right? But that money, it gets spent pretty quickly when you start looking at salaries and all the different costs associated with research. Some of the grants, some of the factors that are very important in funding grants are listed here. So what matters perhaps most is what do the other grants look like in the cycle that your grant came in on? And so you're competing against grants around the same time. And that's not something you can control, but it is a factor to think about. So when a program director says to you, yeah, it's a great grant, but we got 20 phenomenal grants in this other area and we're trying to fill this gap, you know, that's something that you need to be aware of. The time in the fiscal year, I wouldn't have known this before coming to NIH a couple of years ago, but the time in the fiscal year really matters. September 30th is a magical day. That's a day when the government has to spend all of the money it had for the fiscal year, and then everything changes over the next day on October 1st. What do you think happens when we have $200,000 laying around? What's the first thing we do? We start looking through our list of people who we didn't fund, who maybe were close, and we see if we can use that money to fund them. And so that's another reason to be in touch with a program director. As you get closer to the end of the fiscal year, you can get a sense of whether you're on that list. We have something called a late list, and the late list is where we pluck grants at the end of the year to finish spending out our money for the fiscal year. I know this is really weird. In academics, you don't think about spending all of your money by a certain date, but in the government, we do. So it's something that affects you. We also are interested in whether something adds to the portfolio. Do we have 20 grants in the area that you're applying to? And if so, maybe it's not so innovative and it doesn't fill a gap. If it's something that's completely new, we're going to be more interested. Is it covered by other institutes and centers? Is it something we can share the cost of with another institute at NIH? Is the downstream effect on cancer clear? I have to say one of the problems that we often have with basic behavioral science is applications come in and the connection hasn't been made because the principal investigator hasn't been given enough grantsmanship practice at writing how their ideas are related to the health outcome that's being addressed by that institute. I will tell you that there are many people, myself included, who are not convinced that we should have 27 institutes, that maybe things should be more general. But this is the world we live in, and so if you want to get a grant from the National Cancer Institute, it's got to have something to do with cancer, and we can help you think through how to make that clear. And then finally, can it be done more easily and less expensively within an existing infrastructure? I'm a social psychologist, and I can tell you I was trained, like I'm sure many of you were, to think that you do everything in your lab, and you don't work outside your lab. And the world is changing. We're doing a lot more interdisciplinary research, and one of the positive outcomes of that is that we can often collect data in the context of big infrastructures where there already are longitudinal samples that fill out questionnaires over an extended period of time. And if you can do your work in that context, that's even better than trying to do it de novo with a new population. Okay, winding down here, I do want to emphasize that we're not just a grant-giving organization. We have lots of tools that people can use for their own research and also to support their grants. Some of these are actual data sets that you can download and publish off of, and we've had many people do that, like the Health Information National Trend Survey. Some of them are tools people can use, like the Team Science Toolkit, which has all kinds of tools for people forming interdisciplinary teams. And others of these are just sites that you can go to get research information. Smokefree.gov, for example, is a smoking cessation tool. We have a number of different training mechanisms we support. 2 of them are internal, where we bring people to NCI to work with us, and one of them is a grant, the K Award. Most social psychologists don't get K Awards because K Awards buy you out of everything, teaching, administration, and so on. And most of the people who attend SPSP and are trying to get grants are in departments where they're expected to teach and go to faculty meetings, and do stuff like that. But if you're interested in a K award, you can talk to us about that. That's pretty much a career award that funds your salary and all your research. And then the Cancer Prevention Fellowship Program and the Cancer Research Training Awards are postdoctoral opportunities where you can come to NCI and do research with us. We have access to lots of interesting data sets, nationally representative surveys, small experiments, pilot projects, focus group data, all kinds of things. And you can work with our scientists to try to publish off of those data. And we've had some really remarkable people come our way who then went off and got really phenomenal jobs. If you go to our website, and if you go to Google, just type in DCCPS NCI, that's Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences, National Cancer Institute. You'll get right to our website, and you'll see all of these links. And it links all of the different funding opportunities that we have. But the important thing is, and I'm going to say this in a coming slide, the important thing is to not just do this by yourself, to get help, get some feedback, talk to people in your department or at your university or research institution who have gotten cancer funding, excuse me, and make sure that when you're writing these applications, you're doing it in a way that reflects good grantsmanship and is going to be appealing to a peer review study section. So here's that slide I alluded to. You may not be aware of this, and I certainly wasn't until I started getting into this game, but program directors at NIH really are not there to make your life miserable. They're there to make your life good. They want to make you happy. They want you to get funded. This is not like contacting an editor of a journal and saying, I want to submit this paper. Do you think it has any possibilities? You think you'd accept it if it was a good paper? You don't do that. You just don't do that. You submit the paper when it's done. That is not the way to do things with grants. And you'll hear the same thing from NSF and from other agencies. You should talk to program officers in advance and get feedback about how to make your work as appealing as possible. That's a really key piece of getting funded. If you go to our website, the Behavioral Research Program website, which is on the National Cancer Institute site, you will see a list of all of our staff, many of whom, as I said, have PhDs in psychology. You can read about their research, their interests, and you can contact them. You can email them or call them and say, hey, I have a grant idea. Can you help me with this? And they will ask you to send a one-pager that explains what you want to do, and they'll give you feedback. And they'll talk to you about your ideas and give you some sense of how you can formulate your idea in such a way that it might be fundable. So keep in touch with us, and we have many principal investigators who maintain relationships with program directors for years over multiple different grants. All right, the last thing to say, and here's one of those 2 or 3 takeaways, and it's my email address. If you have any questions about anything I've talked about, or if you want me to point you in the direction of one of our program directors in our behavioral research program, I'm happy to do that. Write down my email here, kleinwm@mail.nih.gov, and I'd be happy to help you in any way. And I'll stop there.